Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Koji, and in this video I'm going to do a review and comparison between the two swords before me, both of which are marketed as blunt and unsharpened practice Iaito katanas. Now let me reiterate that. Blunt and unsharpened practice katanas. We're going to revisit that a little later. However, one of these swords is actually worth 4 times more than the other. The first sword that we have here on top is a sword manufactured by a company called Ryujin, which actually consists of members that had previously left a larger and more well-known sword manufacturing company by the name of Musashi. Now, if you know Musashi swords, you'll know that some of their swords are generally built on the cheaper side. However, this Ryujin sword doesn't reflect that same level of quality. In fact, the build of this sword is actually quite impressive for the price value. Now, if you're a more avid sword collector or sword enthusiast, you may notice that this second sword that we have here is actually a piece made by the very well-known and very well-established sword manufacturer Chen Hanwei, which many would actually consider to be the gold standard for quality, handmade, modern-day swords. Now, the Ryujin sword retails between $99 and $125, while the Chen Hanwei sword retails on average around $400 to $450. Now, I say average because the price of the sword actually varies greatly amongst retailers, as low as $300 and some as high as over $500, but the sword generally hovers around the $400 range. Now let's get these swords unsheathed so we can continue with the rest of the review. Now that we have these swords both unsheathed, we can now marvel at the craftsmanship of both these manufacturers. Now, since these swords are practice swords and are intended to be handled quite frequently, both these manufacturers built these swords with the longevity of the sword in mind. Both these swords have maintenance-free blades and hand-forged carbon steel fittings, but that's pretty much where the similarities between these swords end. The Ryujin sword is sporting a handmade, differentially hardened 65 MN spring steel blade with a heat-tempered hamon, and like I mentioned before, has forged carbon steel fittings with a cotton cord wrapped handle with real rayskin and brass ornamentation. The Hanwei sword, on the other hand, has a high carbon steel hand-forged blade with a bohi and an etched-on hamon, and once again with forged carbon steel fittings, but it also has an imitation leather wrapped handle with imitation rayskin and copper fittings. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, why would a name brand sword that I'm paying $400+ for have imitation materials and not something like real leather or real rayskin? But like I mentioned before, these swords are built with the longevity of the sword in mind, so synthetic materials are going to last longer than that of real leather or real rayskin. Speaking of rayskin, you may not be able to see it on camera, but the rayskin in the Ryujin sword is actually starting to darken and stain, and that is due to the sweat, oils, and dirt coming off of my hand due to handling the sword so frequently. Also, the synthetic leather that they have here wrapped on the Hanwei sword is actually similar to that of Alcantara, which is more commonly used as upholstery for the interior of very high-end sports cars. Plus, you'll notice that the handle of the Hanwei sword is actually wider than that of the Ryujin sword, which actually adds some added comfort to the Hanwei sword when handling it. So that's a plus for the Hanwei sword. Another thing I like about the Hanwei sword is the presence of the bohi, or the groove, which you see here running down the spine of the blade. And because it's there, when I'm practicing cutting with this sword, if I get the cut right, I get a really sharp swishing sound when performing a cut with the sword, so I really like that feedback. It also helps with the weight of the sword. The Ryujin sword is actually the heavier of the two swords by around 4 ounces. I actually weigh both these swords on a scale, and yes, the Ryujin sword is in fact heavier, and while 4 ounces may not seem like a huge amount of difference, it is actually a noticeable 4 ounces. And this is mostly because there's more metal on the blade of the Ryujin sword. The Hanwei sword has the bohi, which means more metal has been taken out of the blade, and the blade actually tapers more towards the tip than the Ryujin sword, which means that the Hanwei sword has less metal on the blade than the Ryujin sword, making it, in fact, the lighter of the two swords. So another plus to the Hanwei sword. But there are still a lot of things that I really like about the Ryujin sword, one of which is the ornamentation of the fittings that it has. Once again, both these swords have forged carbon steel fittings but the Ryujin sword has a little bit nicer fittings, with the pommel cap having texture and design at the bottom, and the sword guard, or tsuba, has on one side an Asian dragon and on the other what appears to be Mount Fuji. Also, the Ryujin sword draws and sheathes very smoothly. If you're somebody that practices Iaido or even Kenjutsu, one of the aspects that you train with the sword outside of cutting is drawing and sheathing the sword. And the Ryujin sword does that very nicely. The draw and sheathing of the sword is extremely smooth, buttery smooth in fact. Now that doesn't mean that the Hanwei sword is worse at drawing. Actually, both these swords draw very well, and I practice Bato, or if you're familiar with the anime Rurouni Kenshin, Bato Jutsu, with both these swords getting very excellent results. The problem I have with the Hanwei sword has more to do with a cosmetic feature of the sword, and that has to do with the etched hamon, which means that the hamon has a bit of a grainy texture to it, and upon drawing or sheathing the sword where the blade would rub against the wood inside the scabbard, it creates a sound that I equate to something similar to that of nails on a chalkboard, which I will demonstrate for you. Now, many people may not have a problem with that sound, but that's just a personal gripe I have with the Hanwei sword. Now, the biggest problem that I have exists with both of these swords, and that is due to the fact that neither of these swords are 100% blunt. In fact, both these swords have a very, very fine, very, very sharp tip at the end of each of their blades. The Ryujin's blade still has a very, very sharp cutting edge from here to the tip of the sword. It's razor sharp. And that problem comes up when I have a training partner with me, and even though we are not doing any full contact and just some light sword work, I still am putting his life in danger by having a very, very sharp tip pointed directly at him. The Hanwei sword, on the other hand, is a different story, which warrants another demonstration, which I shall show you now. Here is the Ryujin Iaito Katana and a regular piece of printer paper. As you can see, it is blunt pretty much all the way up and down the sword, but like I mentioned before, still a pretty sharp tip. But now here is the Hanwei practice Iaido sword. Blunt and unsharpened practice sword. Yes, Hanwei's unsharpened practice Iaido sword still has an edge. And upon further inspection of the blade, I was able to figure out what in fact is going on, and I shall now illustrate that for you with my whiteboard here. Now, what you're seeing here would be cutaway profiles of a sword if you were to cut the blade and look directly at it. This is ideally what the edge of a hand-forged sword should look like, with the exception of some beveling, but that would vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. This is the profile of the Ryujin sword, and as you can see, the edge is completely rounded over, again with the exception of the tip. Now, while this illustration is probably exaggerating what's really going on the sword, this is what most likely the Chen Hanwei sword profile actually looks like. As you can see, the edge isn't completely flat. It actually raises up more on one side, which actually means that it has a little bit of an edge still there. Now, my theory as to what happened with the Chen Katana is that when the sword blade was forged, they took a machine to it and went across the very edge of the blade with the intent of making it flat, but when they did it, they probably put it at just a little bit of an angle, which means that one part of the blade still has a rising edge to it. Now, I know this is just an oversight done in the manufacturing process, and it is possible that I got just one bad egg, but when you're paying around $400 for a name brand katana, you would probably expect this kind of a thing not to be overlooked. And that means I'm going to have to do some work to remove what's left of the edge of that sword. Now, when it comes to my overall opinion about both these swords, I really like both of them. I train with both of them all the time, and I love how they feel. The Hanwei sword is actually more comfortable to handle with the materials that they use, the tight wrap and the wider handle, but the Ryujin sword is much smoother on the draw and sheathing. I just really like how it feels. But when you're factoring price into these swords, I favor the Ryujin sword because you just get so good of a sword for around $100. I am seriously impressed with the craftsmanship of this sword. Usually for $100, you don't get a differentially hardened, hand-forged spring steel blade with carbon steel fittings. So this is a real bargain for $100. And yes, while the Hanwei Iaido sword is retailing for around $300 and some even less, which does now make it more affordable, I'm still going to give the edge to the Ryujin sword, since the Hanwei sword already has one. But that is all I have for this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch it. I do intend to do some more in-depth reviews for each of these swords individually, so if you want to see that, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. But once again, thank you for taking time to watch my video. I greatly appreciate it, and remember, train safe, have fun, and I hope I'll see you in the next one. Take care now.